regarded as the Jose Marte School in St. Catherine. We are really happy to have you, and always you're welcome to come back and spend the day with us. It's a good time to get out of school. Tell your teachers that you want to come and visit the Parliament. You get a Friday off. To your teachers, thank you very much for considering us on your day out, and please ensure that when you are going in, your transportation, the drivers of your transportation operate their vehicle within the terms of the Road Traffic Act and get the kids and you all home safely. So thanks again for joining us. Further, before we begin the business, just to indicate that, as you would all have been informed, there was an incident here on the first day of June where a flammable liquid was poured on the front door and set alight. The incident itself did not result in any significant damage to the building. What it did result in, however, was a review of the security measures which are presently in place at the Parliament. At the time of the incident, police officers were in fact on duty. One was internal and the other external, and as a result of their vigilance, no serious damage was done to the property. The Police High Command subsequently met, or members of the Police High Command subsequently met with the clerk and her security team, including the marshal, and a full review of the security procedures have been occasioned as a result of that incident. I will, from time to time, bring members up to date on any decisions taken as it relates to the security. One thing I can say is that you would have noticed that from the video footage which was circulated online and in the news media, that the camera system was certainly required a bit of updating, and we are in the process of doing that now. But there are some other aspects of the security arrangements which I will brief maybe the leaders of two sides if you think it appropriate, because it's not information that would normally go into the public space. Thank you. Statements by ministers. Leader.
Mr. President, if I might apologize on behalf of Senator Samuda. He is delayed by an Oceans event, ironically or coincidentally, and has asked that with your leave we be allowed later in the day's proceedings to recommit this item to the agenda to allow him to make his presentation. So there is to be a statement
by Minister Samuda.
I thank you, yes.
Very well. And an Oceans event. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the Senate are the following: Annual Report of the Montego Bay Convention Center for the year 2019-2020. Under the National Housing Trust Act, the National Housing Trust, Housing Benefits, Special Selection, Perth 1A Housing Development Order 2024, and the National Housing Trust, Housing Benefits, Special Selection, Catherine Estates Housing Development, Batch 2 Order 2024. Thank you, Mr. President.
Bills brought from the Honorable House of Representatives.
The following is a message from the Speaker of the House of Representatives. To the Honorable Senate, I have the honor to advise the Honorable Senate on the following bills. On the 28th day of May 2024, a bill entitled An Act to Amend Section 61 of the Constitution of Jamaica to provide for new words of enactment was passed in the House of Representatives. On the 29th day of May 2024, a bill entitled An Act to Repeal and Replace the Customs Act and to provide for connected matters was passed in the House of Representatives with amendments. On the 4th day of June 2024, a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act was passed in the House of Representatives with amendment. Signed, Juliet Olness, MP, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Mr. President, I signify my willingness to take charge of the bill entitled An Act to Amend Section 61 of the Constitution of Jamaica to provide for new words of enactment, and the bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act.
Thank you.
Mr. President, I signify my willingness to take charge of the Act to repeal and replace the Customs Act and provide for connected matters.
A bill shortly entitled the Constitution Amendment of Section 61 Act 2024, read the first time. A bill entitled the Custom Act 2024, read the first time. A bill shortly entitled the Financial Administration and Audit Amendment Act 2024, read the first time.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bills of which I have signified my willingness to take charge.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the second reading of the Customs Act.
Thank you, Ministers. Before we proceed, I just indicate on behalf of the clerk and our staff an apology in relation to the situation which existed last week with the tabling of the Customs Act. You'll notice it is a rather large document and had been sent to the printers on the Tuesday afternoon, I believe, Madam Clerk, and had not been sent to the Parliament in time from the printers, although assurances were given, and that is why the clerk had put it to the end of the agenda. In the upshot, both the Constitution Amendment Act and the Customs Act are tabled today. Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally, questions and answers to questions. I'm sorry. Notices of motions given orally.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion under the Interception of Communications Act. Whereas under Section 18(1) of the Interception of Communications Act, the Minister may, by order, add to or delete from the list of offences contained in the first schedule. And whereas under Section 18(1) of the Act, the Minister made the Interception of Communications Amendment to First Schedule Order 2024, and whereas it is provided by Section 18(2) of the Act that an order made under Section 18(1) shall be subject to affirmative resolution, and whereas it is desirable that the Interception of Communications Amendment to First Schedule Order 2024 be affirmed, now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as the Interception of Communications Amendment to First Schedule Order 2024 resolution. And 2. The Interception of Communications Amendment to First Schedule Order 2024 is affirmed. Mr. President, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Thank you, Minister. Questions and answers to questions? Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sitting of the Senate. Motions for leave to introduce bills. The presentation of bills without the leave of the Senate first obtained. Public business. Minister.
Mr. President, I now move, for the suspension of standing orders to allow me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Members would have heard the question. Those in favor? Against? Minister Samuda, we heard that you were detained by the ocean. We couldn't quite figure out. And then the minister made it worse by saying it wasn't the ocean, it was an oceanic event, which...
Minister, I assure you that is not what was said. Thank you. But it's welcome, Minister, and we know that the event was an important one. This is the time of the blue economy, the time of the oceans now, and it is important for Jamaica to have its say on these matters of important policy that has future impact. So welcome, and I'm presuming that you don't wish to take your statement now, you wish to catch your breath.
Yes.
Mr. President, the fight against crime and violence in Jamaica is an everyday effort in which gains are thankfully being made, but the battle is uphill, all hands are needed on deck, and indeed all tools are needed to hand. The Interception of Communications Act came into operation on the 15th of March 2002 and was last amended in 2015. If I might call it the Intercept Act going forward, it provides for the issuance of warrants for the interception of communications sent by means of the telecommunications network, and it serves as a critical tool in the fight against serious and organized crime in Jamaica, in which firearms feature significantly. The order before us today was affirmed in that other place on the 23rd of April and tabled together with its relevant resolution in this Honorable Senate on the 10th of May. It seeks to amend the first schedule of the Intercept Act, which is that part of the Act that sets out the legislation that provides for offenses in relation to which warrants can be sought under the Intercept Act. Paragraphs 7, 8, and 9 of that first schedule, however, refer specifically to the old Firearms Act of 1967. So senators would recall, of course, that one of the government's major policies has been a stronger stance on gun-related crimes. And the fact is that for years it was acknowledged that the percentage of serious crimes involving firearms was and remains significant. So in 2022, the data showed that 85% of murders and 80% of robberies nationally involved the use of firearms. So the repeal and replacement of the 1967 Act to legislate for much stronger consequences and a major expansion of the offenses created by law was therefore undertaken to capture the complexities of developments in the criminal realm. So this amendment to the Interception of Communications Act removes the reference in the first schedule to the old Firearms Act 1967 and substitutes same with the new Firearms Prohibition, Restriction, and Regulation Act 2022. The amendment is necessary to enable authorized officers, and we recall that authorized officers is quite a narrow grouping. As defined in the legislation, it enables them to apply to a judge in chambers for a warrant authorizing the interception of communications of persons to prevent or detect offenses under the firearms legislation. And we recognize and we recall that the Intercept Act actually has a framework with guardrails for the considerations that a judge may make and the circumstances in which a warrant will be granted. These matters, of course, have developed some maturity now in terms of their jurisprudence because there have been years over which these types of applications have been made. The amendment provides, therefore, to access to additional offenses created by the recently enacted legislation and will remove the risk of denial of applications to the court for intercepts based on the judge forming the view that the offenses under the repealed legislation do not correspond with the law that is presently in force. And this is absolutely critical. As I said before, this is now a fairly mature process with strong guardrails, but one which requires our legislative attention today. So as indicated, Mr. President, the order seeks to delete paragraph 7 and substitute a reference to the Prohibition, Restriction, and Regulation Act, and to delete paragraphs 8 and 9 and to renumber accordingly. Mr. President, it cannot be overstated how important the tool of the Intercept Act is in respect of fighting organized crime. And when you recognize the relationship between firearms offenses and organized crime, you understand the importance of the amendment today, as brief as the order is. So it is important to preserve the investigative process and ensure the effectiveness and availability of this tool in supporting ongoing investigations of the police and their efforts to remain ahead of criminal actors. So in this context, as we continue to seek as a legislature to support and enable law enforcement agencies and to strengthen the legislative framework towards making Jamaica the place to live, work, and do business and raise families, I commend this order for affirmation to the Senate and look forward to the contributions of colleagues. I thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Bunting.
Thank you, Mr. President. I hope you don't mind me just also welcoming, especially welcoming those students from Jose Marti. They must be very proud to attend a school named after that Cuban poet, patriot, and martyr. Poet, patriot, hero, and national hero and martyr, whose name has become a synonym for liberty in the region. And so I wish I could say that I had worn this tie to match their colors, but it is a happy coincidence this morning.
You're speaking about Jose Marti. I take it that you know that he actually spent some time in Jamaica.
Yes, I'm aware. On one of my visits, I was given a thorough education, much of which I don't recall the details now, but of the long history of Jamaica, Cuban traffic in terms of trade, in terms of people going to work in both directions, etc., and how many Cubans today have Jamaican ancestors and vice versa. So I know there is a long, deep connection going back to the time of the revolutions in the
War of Independence.
Yeah, for independence in the 1900s.
Okay, thank you very much.
The amendment to the first schedule today, Minister, is not controversial, is not one that we would oppose, although I will say it would have been much tidier if at the time we were passing the legislation we had included this as a consequential amendment to the Interception of Communications Act as part of that bill and that debate. However, it has been caught, and we're not, apart from pointing to the sloppiness of the administration of bringing that bill into being. I'm not going to pillory you on that anymore. However, you refer to the fact that the Interception of Communications Act is about 2 decades old, roughly. It's been amended a couple of times. I think you said 2015 was the last amendment. I think it was actually amended in 2020 when a provision was made for urgent situations, abductions, kidnappings, etc. No, that was a very substantive amendment, because law enforcement did not have to wait to go to get a warrant from a judge. All other situations prior, you needed a warrant to lawfully intercept communications. But given the development of technology, even in the last 5 years, the interceptions of communication by law enforcement has become increasingly complex due to technological advancements. Certainly over the past 2 decades, but more so even in the last 5 to 10 years. So balancing effective law enforcement with the protection of privacy and civil liberties require continuous adaptation of the legal frameworks, the ethical guidelines, and the oversight mechanisms for such an act. And I know as an attorney you would appreciate that the need for that delicate balance between all the competing public interests, Mr. President. So I would really say that what we need now is a thorough overhaul of this piece of legislation, something that will allow it to properly address the challenges. It is a powerful tool, certainly, for investigators, but we want to ensure that our laws are up to date with how it is being used or potentially could be used by law enforcement. And I would say, for example, one thing we introduced back in 2013, 14 as part of the Unite for Change initiative, we had introduced the Ministry of National Security a smartphone app that was referred to as the Stay Alert app. And one of the things it had... No, I don't think it was yet. But one of the things it had, for example, was a panic button. That persons who downloaded this app from the ministry, they had a panic button. And if they were in a situation, for example, like I understand the teacher may have been in when they were being abducted, had they had that app and had they pressed the panic button, it would have allowed law enforcement to track them on a live basis and understand that they're in danger and either arrange to intercept the vehicle or to respond to the last location and so on. So it's not just in terms of investigations after the fact. The technology can be used to greatly assist in real time and perhaps prevent serious harm or injury coming to victims. I don't know what has happened to that app, but I gather it's not generally available anymore. But the bigger point is whether that app, which was written 10 years ago, would have had to have been continually updated. And a lot of private security companies, vehicle tracking companies, etc., now offer similar things. But the beauty of this was that it was available free of charge to all Jamaicans. This is 2013. It was available free of charge to all Jamaicans, not just those who could afford it. And I would commend to the government, to you, Minister, to look at, once again, offering such a service. We hear many, many complaints, especially in rural areas, of persons calling police stations, not getting a response on the phone, or even getting a response on the phone, and they struggle to give directions to the police where to go, because as we know, much of Jamaica, we don't have persons who can describe their home by a street name and a street number. So the beauty of this technology is that it essentially transmitted a GPS pin to law enforcement, and they could use that together with one of the mapping apps, Google Maps or one of those, to be able to find the location of the person. And it kept pinging so that even if the person was moving, it would give their current location. And I really commend both from the digital side and from the law enforcement side that this would be a worthwhile investment to something to make available that would contribute substantially to the safety and security, particularly of our students who are traveling to and from home on their own without parental supervision, and especially users of public transport, and particularly our women. But law enforcement today face additional challenges in intercepting communications. One is the widespread adoption of end-to-end encryption in messaging apps. WhatsApp, in Telegram, in Signal. This makes it much more difficult for law enforcement to access communications, even with a warrant. Law enforcement agencies argue for backdoors and encryption, etc., but tech companies and privacy advocates resist, citing, reasonably so, security and privacy risks. One of the challenges that I know the JCF has, and in particular those technicians that deal with areas like interception of communications, is in retaining those who are most highly trained. I recalled, in fact, just this morning, I refreshed myself and called one of the persons I knew were involved in the training of, I think it was about 15 or so technicians while I was minister, at collaborating with our international partners. And it provided great value in terms of the human resource capabilities. Of course, it was combined with technical capabilities. But I was told 90% of those people, having received this high level of training, have now gone on to greener pastures. And I think there are probably only two of the original group that are left there. So this is an area that requires constant reinvestment, constant upgrading, constant training. There are other areas that come into this delicate balance between security and privacy. For example, we now have mass surveillance capabilities, particularly coming from artificial intelligence. Again, I think we need to have legislation that confronts clearly and establishes clear guidelines between what you can use, what and how you can use, what are the limits of the use of this surveillance. Another area that is currently one that I think needs to be addressed in the Interception of Communications Act is what is called, Mr. President, the metadata. So, for example, in order to intercept a call or to intercept an email or something, you would require a warrant under the Act. But law enforcement increasingly relies on metadata, the time, location, the duration of the communications as part of their investigations. And I'm not advocating that should not be done, don't get me wrong. But I'm saying these things should be addressed explicitly in the Interception of Communications Act. Because, again, if we don't carefully examine and make the legal distinctions between content and metadata being scrutinized, we can breach people's privacy rights, because metadata can tell you a lot without actually listening to the calls. It can tell you a lot. So again, I think this is one of the reasons I say, Minister, the Act needs to be updated to make it very clear in these areas. I don't think metadata is addressed at all in the old Act. And I think the conditions or the circumstances under which it can be accessed for investigative purposes, for evidentiary purposes, etc., should be clearly outlined. And of course, you have other issues, and I won't prolong, but we'll just identify them as things that I think would need to be done in this overhaul or review of the interception of communications. Cross-border data access. We know that criminal gangs don't limit themselves, or criminal organizations don't limit themselves by sovereign boundaries. And oftentimes, a lot of these communications and data access is needed across jurisdictions. The use of artificial intelligence AI and machine learning can now analyze vast amounts of data, vast amounts of intercepted communications. Again, we want to ensure transparency and accountability in the use of AI in surveillance. And this might require new regulations and new mechanisms, new oversight mechanisms. We have issues like the Internet of Things, which make it much easier to introduce new vectors for surveillance. We have social media monitoring. Law enforcement today, globally, uses social media monitoring for intelligence gathering. But again, when you combine that with artificial intelligence that can gather vast amounts of data, this can lead to overreach and potential violation of free speech and privacy rights. So I just raise some of these to show you that there is, notwithstanding, in the scheme of our laws, a 2-decade-old law might not be a very old law, but relative to the speed at which technology is advancing, it is ancient. And therefore, there is an imperative for a root and branch overhaul and review of this law, together with the new issues that have arisen since, so that there's adequate legal and ethical oversight to its use by law enforcement or whatever other agency. I hope that you will think, Minister, that my intervention has been constructive and just pointing to the direction that which we need to go, even though this may have been a relatively minor and uncontroversial. I think as it is before us now, we should use the opportunity to perhaps recognize that it needs to be brought forward. A more thorough review of the Act needs to be brought forward and addressed, especially in light of new developments, not just in technology, but the new sensitivities around people's constitutional rights, the privacy, the Data Privacy Act, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 1 minute, 1 minute, Minister. Thank you very much, Senator Bunting. Senator Brown.
Thank you, President. Mr. President, I wish to make a few comments on this order, but permit me, President, to structure my presentation against the background of a poem written many years ago entitled Cultivo una Rosa Blanca, to tend a white rose, by the great Osemate. And the poem goes as follows. I have a white rose to tend in July as in January. We not allow foreign language in the parliament, not even patois. I give it to the true friend who offers his frank hands to me. And for the cruel one whose blow break the heart by which I live, thistle nor thorn do I give. For him too, I have a white rose. So both for the friends and the enemies, we give white rose. And it's, in a sense, it calls for consistency, treating everybody equal, fairly, and in the same way. So when the minister, the leader of the Senate, Government Business in the Senate, said, we cannot overestimate the importance of the Interception of Communication Act to the crime fighting. Minister, that warmed my heart. Because I am old enough to remember, in 2002, the objections, the criticisms, the resistance when this legislation was brought to the parliament. It represented the vision of part of those 18 years that we so often criticize as wasted. So when this government embraces the Intercept of Communication Act, I said to myself, what was all of that thistle and torn about in the past? I remember, President, that arising from criticism of this principal act from which this order comes, a former commissioner of police coined the term Constable Red Herring, because this legislation from which this order comes have been critical in helping to put away out of society some of the bad players, some of the crime producers. And Senator Bunting, you're absolutely right. There was a time when a government felt that sharing information with foreign partners in the fight against crime was a bad thing. Was a bad thing. Prime Minister went on record as being critical. I'm trying to remember, but it was one on our side. Prime Ministers have been on record of making it clear where the Constitution starts and stops, certainly not in Ligini. And so, this legislation that was so vilified is today part of this government crime-fighting strategy. And yes, Minister, too many people are dying by the gun. 85% of all murders are firearm-related. So as Senator Bunting said, we support this. This is why we had the vision way back then against opposition to pass this legislation. It's not just in Jamaica. Internationally, we're seeing cases, including former presidents, where the use of telephones and the communication therefrom becomes critical in determining guilt or innocence. Recently, depends on which side you sit, Senator Hill, we had the privilege of hearing guilty 34 times. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, all the way to 34. I said, depend on which side we sit. I'm coming back. So, President, the Interception of Communication Act was part of a vision of fighting crime. And so, I call for us to be consistent. If you consistently oppose, consistently oppose. But you can't be opposing one day, supporting, depending on which side of the aisle you sit in. That's correct. That's correct. But you can't be arguing when you're in government. That is good. But when you're in opposition, it's bad. Which brings me, President, to a point which you raised earlier in your opening about the attack on this parliament. I would certainly not criticize the government for, on the basis that the government that cannot protect the highest court of the land would not be able to protect the citizens of the country. So I claim no paternity for that statement, President. But today, I will certainly say to the government, I hope that as part of protecting the people of the country, even though the murder levels are higher than in 2014, that we're going to look. In 2014, when the attack happened, attempt to burn down the parliament, breaking through the windows in the back, we were told we're going to review the security measures. So I'm assuming that last week was an upgrade on 2014. And the reality, Mr. President, is with face recognition and all of that technology, we ought to move to protect. But more importantly, President, the documents, and I don't know the intercept of communication will allow for record keeping. But the documents of the Parliament, I hope that they are scanned, Senator Samuda, stored off-site, stored in the cloud, so that an attack on the physical Parliament would not do as much damage as if to say we lose all the records and the history of this Parliament. So as Senator Bunting asked for an update, an upgrade of our security architecture relative to the Interception of Communication Act and the matters related thereto. I also make a plea for an upgrading of our record keeping of the Parliament. I would hate it, Mr. President, that when my friends on the other side wish to go back to Ansard to find what I said some time ago that may be consistent or inconsistent with a position I adopt, that they won't be able to find it because it was destroyed. Let us make sure the continuity certainly it's not at NNN. I'm glad it's not at NNN. Certainly the continuity of our Parliament and our parliamentary business in the modern era of technology require more than just a physical paper. It requires, Senator, responsibility for digitalization. This is a project I recommend to you to ensure that our Parliament is digitalized. The records are stored off-site in addition to the physical records that are here. It is important for this generation and future generations to come. Because I look forward to the day, Mr. President, when just as the government has flipped on the matter of the ICA, that one day they will take the same approach to the Caribbean Court of Justice. May it please you, Mr. President.
You know, just before Senator, just before you continue, Minister, just in case later I see in the social media when I said that the government of the day was vilified, nobody said anything. Just in case I read that later, I have no recollection of anybody being vilified when the legislation was passed. There was a thrust to ensure that the rights of the citizens to privacy was maintained. Minister. And the type of stone. And the type of the hog who occupied the pen. Minister, thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Brown.
Thank you. It's all right. Thank you, though. Yeah, I work with this. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to Senators Bunting and Brown for their contributions today. I had actually intended to start with the point that the very issue that Senator Bunting raised, which is, of course, the fact that privacy and civil liberties continue to be issues of importance and ones that must be properly balanced in a bill or in an act, such as the Interception of Communications Act, that I agree with that. And that was, in fact, the thinking behind the debate, the initial debate which took place in respect of the Intercept Act when it first came about. It was new, and it did threaten previously held concepts of privacy and civil liberties, and accordingly was well debated and appropriately debated. And parliamentary debate is a part of the democratic process. So I wouldn't view it as inconsistency. In the very way that it was raised at the start of a process is the very same way that Senator Bunting sees that at this particular juncture in technological developments, that those issues must be viewed as well. So I don't view that issue in a contentious way at all, and I don't view it as a change in perspective. What I view it is the continuum of time, the maturity of use of legislative tools, and the fact that these issues must always be kept under view. So thank you. The issue being that matters of this nature should always be kept under view. I'm not sure, and I'm sure the Ministry of National Security will consider whether a complete overhaul is necessary, because the truth is that the balance that came out of the parliamentary process at the time that this was debated and then next amended did actually result in quite a sound, technologically neutral bill. And there was a lot of emphasis placed on technological neutrality. I recall I was in the matter of telecoms at the time. I was in that sector, and this issue of how it is that such a bill would be allowed to live and the impact that it would have over a period of time, recognizing that technology is always ahead of legislation. You know, even in the financial sector, developments are always ahead of regulation just because of the nature of the dynamism of the sector, of the sectors. So I believe these issues must always be taken under view, but I'm sure the ministry will consider the scope of any review which is necessary at this time. But the provisions are technology neutral, which is something that I think the relevant security agencies and the courts need to keep in mind as they consider how it is these matters are used. I do want to say also that the guardrails provided in this legislation are significant and continue to be, so that I think Senator Bunting, and this is not to pillory you, but it is to say that I think there might be a memory failure, because there wasn't an amendment in 2020. There was an amendment to the order in 2019 to allow for an adjustment in respect of the Criminal Suppression of Gangs Act. But there was nothing in relation to emergency warrants. Those were actually in the original bill. They remain in the original bill, and everything under this act, every intercept must be by warrant. The only difference is that under Section 7, in respect of emergency circumstances, you can make the application verbally. The application doesn't have to be in writing, but there is a warrant required, even in circumstances such as a kidnapping or other urgent circumstances. So again, no pillorying, just for accuracy of the record, in ensuring that we are reviewing and keeping the provisions in mind, ensuring that people understand properly what is before us and what may need review and what actually doesn't. So this is actually provided for already. On the matter of, and of course, we have all the provisions in respect of a limited number of persons who can apply, and the level of seniority which they must have, and the circumstances which a judge must consider, and they range from national security, interests of the administration of justice, the offenses provided for, and a series of provisions set out, if I recall correctly, in Section 4 and 5. So it is, the durations of warrants are also limited, and you must apply again for extension. So there are a series of guardrails, again, to say that there was a technological neutrality to the process and to the framework, which should be commended, recognizing that it continues to be a useful tool, perhaps with one or two thistles and thorns, Senator Brown, but not such which are not appropriately managed by the justice system as it currently exists. So I wanted to make that point. I wanted to also, just in respect of the Stay Alert app, which was raised earlier, very good concept, undoubtedly. It did unfortunately have technical issues and very, very, very limited take-up because of these deficiencies. And there were months on end where there would be not even one alert or one use of the app, despite the significant costs. So the glitches, I know, were being reviewed at a stage, and then I'm not sure what happened. I would have to ask. But the truth is that the idea was absolutely a good idea. And perhaps now, exactly, perhaps now that we have greater mobility to respond, greater monitoring capacity, which is taking place with Jamaica Eye, that perhaps greater technology in terms of the mapping of our roads and the actual greater literacy, digital literacy in terms of people's understanding of the utility of a smartphone, that now that idea may have ripened to a way in which it could be revisited by MNS. But it was taken down because the costs were way exceeding the benefit, and it therefore was not in the overall consideration of overall benefit. So a matter to be reviewed. But that being said, I really want to, addressing those points, I want to thank colleagues for their support of the amendment, which is not a minor amendment. It is an important amendment, although brief. And therefore, Mr. President, as we look at as we consider the matters raised and the importance of the matter before us, I ask that the order be affirmed.
The question is that the order be approved. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, if we could now ask for the recommittal of statements by ministers.
The question is that there be a recommittal to statement by ministers. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Minister Samuda.
Mr. President,
I recognize you, Minister Samuda.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to provide a brief update to this Honorable Senate this morning as it relates to the fourth phase of the ban on specific types of single-use plastic products. This update comes against the backdrop of National Environmental Awareness Week being celebrated this week by Ministry and NEPA, and beyond that, 3 very important international dates of note. These include World Environment Day, celebrated on Wednesday, International Day Against IUU Fishing, also celebrated on Wednesday, and World Oceans Day, which is actually celebrated today by most agencies, but is actually recognized tomorrow by the United Nations. These commemorative days of note are meant to draw global attention to the environmental crises facing our planet. The United Nations Environment Programme references the current situation as the triple planetary crisis, namely referencing climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution with a specific focus on plastics, including single-use or avoidable plastics. At the risk of sounding dramatic, this interconnected combination of calamity has affected every corner of the globe negatively, particularly small island developing states such as Jamaica, and poses severe risks to our quality and way of life. Though interconnected, this morning I will use this opportunity to update the Senate on the most recent measures being taken by this administration in collaboration with our partners to tackle the pillar of pollution and specifically plastic pollution. Historical context is always important, Mr. President. On October 7th, 2016, a private member's motion calling for the ban of single-use plastics was passed in this House, calling on the government to ban expanded polystyrene lunchboxes and single-use plastic bags used in the retail trade. The Cabinet of the day approved the establishment of a technical working group chaired by Dr. Paris Leowai, which examined the issue thoroughly and recommended a phased approach to the ban. Since January 1st of 2019, the government has implemented 3 phases, which have curtailed manufacturing, importation and distribution and use of single-use plastic bags at and below the size of 24 inches by 24 inches, expanded polystyrene foam food containers, plastic drinking straws, and plastic straws attached to juice boxes and drink pouches. 3 phases that targeted non-biodegradable, non-compostable, non-oxidogradable, carcinogenic, non-recyclable plastics for removal from our waste stream, and have been locally and internationally assessed and acknowledged as a success. Mr. President, the public will recall that as early as 2022, and I was actually searching my phone on the way here to try and figure the exact date. It was actually at the launch by the Bureau of Standards of the standard for biodegradability for plastics. We were the first in the region to launch such a standard, that we advised all stakeholders that the 4th phase of the ban on specific single-use plastic products was coming, and the consultation actually commenced then. This proactive move by the government is in keeping with the measures taken by both developing and developed countries to stem the flow of waste plastics in our environment. Indeed, the United Nations Environment Assembly, the decision-making body that sets the global environment agenda, adopted Resolution 514, which directed the United Nations Environment Assembly to convene an intergovernmental negotiating committee to develop a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. The INC is required to complete its negotiation of the new instrument later this year. Jamaica has been actively participating and leading several regional discussions. What does this mean for Jamaica? It means that there will be a shift internationally in how we treat with plastic, including single-use and avoidable plastic products, throughout the full life cycle from cradle to grave. That is, from primary plastic polymers, the units of plastics to produce, the recycling, reuse, repair, refill, and final disposal. There will be a change in standards, and Jamaica will be expected to adhere. In recognition of the important role plastics play in our everyday lives, but also mindful that this product is not biodegradable and some types of plastics are difficult to recycle, it is important that we, the government, take the necessary measures in partnership with the private sector and all the other key stakeholders to safeguard human health and the environment from the adverse effects of plastic pollution. Given all that we know about the dangers plastic pollution poses, the government has taken another step to cauterize the flow of single-use plastics or avoidable plastic products on the local market. Hence, the existing ministerial orders under the Trade Act and the other under the Natural Resources Conservation Act will be amended to include single-use plastic food containers and cosmetic and personal care items with intentionally added microplastics or plastic microbeads. So for instance, you'll find these in some SKUs of deodorants and face soaps and a few other scrubs. What we have found in our marketplace is that there is no brand that does not have options that is without these items. So we will target the items with these particularly added microplastics. With effect from the 1st day of July, no person shall import, distribute, sell, or use any single-use plastic food container made wholly or in part of polyethylene, polypropylene, polylactic acid, excluding the related transparent plastic lids in commercial quantities. This shall not apply to such single-use plastic containers as imported prior to the 1st day of July 2024, understanding the supply chain. With effect from the 1st day of July 2025, no person shall import, distribute, sell, or use any personal care or cosmetic care products for which plastic microbeads or microplastics have been intentionally added. This shall not apply to those cosmetic and personal care products for which plastic microbeads or microplastics have been intentionally added where they were imported before the first day of July 2025. In relation to the single-use plastic food containers, the private sector will have 6 months as of July 1 to deplete the existing stock on the domestic market, and we have found that this has worked well in previous phases of the ban. Additionally, all orders placed prior to July 1, 2024 can be landed. However, evidence of such orders must be presented to the relevant authorities. In relation to the cosmetic care and personal care products with intentionally added microplastics or plastic microbeads, the prohibition of these products will be effected as at January 1 to allow the trade to make necessary adjustments and further sensitize the population. The National Environment and Planning Agency, in collaboration with the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, will be mounting a comprehensive national public education and awareness campaign to support the implementation of the fourth phase of the ban. We ask for the continued support of all stakeholders in the private sector, civil society, and the general public in safeguarding the health of the population and the environment from plastic waste. Just on the way into the Parliament, I was asked by a reporter what was the impact on manufacturing. Though not stated in the statement, I think important to reiterate what I have stated many times. None of these items are manufactured locally and have no impact on local manufacturers. We ask, as we said, for the continued support. The Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, in collaboration with NEPA, in preparation for the fourth phase of the ban, undertook consultations with key stakeholders, including relevant ministries, departments, and agencies through the Technical Working Group on Single-Use Plastic Products, as well as members of the private sector. It is my ministry's intention to continue to proactively engage all stakeholders, including the general public, to encourage their active participation in the decision-making process. The presentation this morning in the Senate is yet another forum to further sensitize all stakeholders of the upcoming measures and to seek your full support on both sides of the aisle. The Ministry, in collaboration with NEPA, will be mounting an intensive public education campaign so that stakeholders can be clear on the types of products that will be regulated under this fourth phase, as well as to reinforce the objective that we all seek to achieve, that is a significant reduction and the ultimate elimination of plastic pollution, especially and including, on today of all days, in the marine environment. Mr. President, I have reminded colleagues here that the target of these phases of the plastic ban have focused primarily on non-recyclable plastics. All plastics are not created equally. The government has, however, acknowledged that this is not the full scale of the problem. The government has acknowledged further that the issue of plastic waste requires a single policy which guides all MDAs and indeed the public on the issue. Mr. President, in fact, your government is taking a suite of measures to address plastic pollution, and I would like to highlight a few of these measures. This is why the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation is actively working on such a policy for all single-use plastics that will guide MDAs. The government of Jamaica continues to support recycling efforts nationally. I am happy to relate to this Honourable House that the Recycling Partners of Jamaica has now achieved an average 35% recovery rate on national monthly production of plastics in Jamaica, meaning for all bottles produced, we are now recycling 35% of them on a monthly basis. This is on the back of a new plant commissioned in Portmore just last year. We further expect RPJ to be breaking ground this week in Mandeville on a second plant. The groundbreaking was actually disrupted by rain, praise God. But Jamaica is targeting a recycling recovery rate of 70% and will work with all stakeholders to achieve this over the next 3 years.
What is an acceptable rate of recycling?
So in much of, many Nordic countries are in the range of about 50 to 60%. But there are anomalies of states or cities that are above 70%. The INC is likely to target a rate above 70% as a global target. The International Negotiating Committee set up by UNIA, by the motion that I had mentioned earlier. But Jamaica is well on its way, Mr. President, having achieved 35%. And we pause to acknowledge all of the partners in the recycling partners of Jamaica, including all the bottle manufacturers who are led by Dr. Damian King as their chairman. So we acknowledge the work and investment being made by these companies. It's the result of a partnership. There was an investment, an initial investment, Senator Brown, I believe, by then Minister Omar Davies in 2015 that started Recycling Partners. Since then, that investment was continued. And then even when that investment period was coming to an end, we were able to negotiate with the bottle manufacturers on a self-imposed cess that is being spent in line with discussion on capital investment by the private sector, on collection depots, on trucks, on manufacturing facilities, and is progressing in line with discussed targets. So, President, I also use the opportunity to again highlight the Most Honorable Prime Minister's commitment to institute a waste separation and recycling program within the public sector. Indeed, this will happen this year, and the program is well underway. The Ministry of Local Government and Community Development and the NSWMA have been implementing a separation at source program in 18 communities within the KMA. The expansion of this initiative will be dependent on further improvement in the waste collection and transportation infrastructure. And again, Mr. President, your government will be tackling the issue of collection for all waste with the procurement of an additional 50 garbage trucks, which is already underway for the NSWMA. Mr. President, strengthening the commitment to PPPs is also another pillar of the government's strategy. The government continues to support the Grace Kennedy Foundation-led Kingston Harbour Cleanup Initiative. Mr. President, design phase, they've already done traps at 7 gullies and have a barge that clears solid waste from this space. And they're about to take on the beast, the behemoth, the Sandy Gully. So the engineers are actually doing the designs now to put in that system that will trap waste, as well as the entry points for that barge and heavy equipment behind to clear waste, which illegally and unfortunately does enter that gully. So we continue to support PPPs through UDC in some cases, Port Authority, NSWMA, and even through the local authorities. Senator Williams will recall when you would have signed that partnership at KCMC. So it is a major pillar to engage the private sector. Mr. President, the ministry, in collaboration with NEPA in the current fiscal year, will be strengthening the policy and legislative frameworks in related to waste management, including the amendment to the wastewater and sludge regulations and the air quality regulations under the NRCA Act. To increase compliance with environmental laws, the ministry will shortly bring to the House amendments to the NRCA and the wildlife protection to allow for an increase in fines and custodial sentences. We will speak in more detail in that latest measure on another occasion very soon, Mr. President. I take this opportunity to express the administration's appreciation to all stakeholders who have been actively supporting the administration's measures to address plastic pollution. In this regard, the administration continues to encourage the private sector, including those MSMEs, to provide consumers with environmentally friendly alternatives to single-use and avoidable plastics. Additionally, we ask consumers to be diligent and to inform yourselves of alternatives available and use this information to make conscious decisions when shopping. The government remains committed to sustainable trade practices while safeguarding the health of the population and our environment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I ask your permission to speak from a seat other than my own. Thank you. You see you? I have no doubt who he sits beside. You know, Mr. President, thank you very much, Minister, for that update to us. And I know it's usual for you to be followed by Senator Fraser Binns, who unfortunately is not here today or at this time. And so I will do my best to channel the questions that she would have had for you. I'll do so in her absence. There is no doubt, Minister, that we are in support. I think all of Jamaica is in support of practices that will help to save our environment, really, because that's what this is all about. So there's no doubt that there is support from this side. There has always been. I think that the biggest concern, however, in any effort like this, which is a mammoth task, as you have put it, rightly so, is to ensure that all who are expected to act, businesses and individuals alike, are fully aware and understanding of the role that they need to play. And therefore, the need for the education of the population, public education campaign, is critical. I note you mentioned that in 2022, sometime in 2022, was when the notice was given, or the intention of phase 4, which began the public the consultation process. And it would have been ideal, I believe, at that point in time or soon thereafter, to begin the public education campaign, which you've just mentioned is about to be to get on the way. The critical issue is that a lot of people, myself included, we are not familiar or very clear outside of the plastic that's obvious to many of us. We understand what a plastic bag is, but when it comes on to microbeads and some of the other elements that you speak of, it's important for all of us to be aware of what those are, because they are in so many products that we use. As a woman myself, if I should think of some of the things that are in my bathroom cabinet, many of them might very well not be good for me. But we need to know, all of us need to know. We don't know, they're in facial scrubs, they're in body washes, they're in lipsticks, lip balms, everything. So the critical thing is for us to all be aware, and this is where the public education comes in, what are these products? Because none of us want to be using products that are unintentionally causing us harm. So I believe, Minister, one of the most important things, if we can get as a people, as users of various products, and I know we were not into the business of listing brands and all of that at this point, but we need to have a clearer understanding. It's online. We need to have a clear understanding of what these products are, because when we speak in the language of microbeads and all these things, nobody knows what those mean. Anything named scrub? Okay. So we will listen to the scientists among us today. I see he uses them. You see, the government not only has a duty to ban where a ban is necessary, but also to create the environment and the framework to allow for us to comply. And that is the intention I'm sure you're going after, Minister. So I urge you and the respective bodies and teams to assist the country in understanding what these are. One of the things that I'd like to understand, and as we see here this bill, the Customs Act, how are we ensuring that with a revision, a new revision like this, that those products are incorporated, for example? So that sort of collaborative effort, it is not sufficient for you to be there doing all that you're doing, and then entities, although you mentioned Bureau of Standards is working hand in hand with you, but what about customs or any other like anti-dumping? Because you made mention of the 6-month period that is allowed to retailers to be able to deplete their stock. Outside of that, there will have to be, I would have imagined, some consideration for dumping. How do we get rid of what might remain. And so I think the collaborative effort between customs and anti-dumping and Bureau standards too, in ensuring that all the efforts are not in vain. So if you could give some indication or at least some consideration to that, I think it would aid us all in ensuring that we comply, and sufficiently so. Again, Minister, at the end of the day, there is not much. Oh, I'd like to know, in 2019, this whole process began. And we know a lot has been achieved, but if you could allow us to appreciate the gains that have been made since 2019 with the introduction of the respective phases, how have we been doing? How has Jamaica been doing? I know you made mention of the 35% recycle rate or the 30% recycle rate, but in terms of compliance to the importation or non-importation and the lack of non-use of these products, it would be good for the country to get an appreciation for how well that has been going. And if not, it might mean that there is a greater need for this campaign. I think many of us have heard the July 1. Many of us have, but then I notice in here, in your statement, there is a delayed implementation for certain areas, understandably so. For example, not until the first day of July 2025, the importation and distribution of personal care products. So it's just to help us to understand, if we could just get a little bit of clarity to that. And it is my hope, and I know that Senator Fraser-Binns, in the event I have not done her justice, which I hope I have, I'm sure her continued dialogue with you will help to also answer some questions that may continue may persist. Mr. President, that's my minor intervention on behalf of my colleague. Oh, that's the only thing, huh? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Allen. Senator, you want to ask it before? You prefer? Go ahead, Minister.
Thank you, Senator Allen. I will give a positive review to Senator Fraser-Binns of your time at the crease. I do note and thank you for the general support of the opposition and understand the concern related to public education. One of the experiences of 2019 is that NEPA's investment in public education on this particular project and even engagement of well-known NGOs to carry the message and support of varying marketing efforts was at that time one of the largest that NEPA itself had undertaken in the environmental space. I don't recall the exact numbers admittedly, but it was a large investment. And the end of that 6-month period, even though you had several voices, marketing effort led by research had been done as a part of that. At the end of that effort, one of the 3 importers of one of the items called my office and said he'd never heard about this. And it was an interesting experience. So one always wonders how much public education is right and when it will hit, when it will connect, when it will resonate, and how it deals with it. But I made the point in that case that one of the items had 3 commercial players. So one of the ways we've designed this public policy is in a manner that doesn't require 3 million people to fully understand every element of it. It's good when they do, and a positive thing when they support you, certainly from a national perspective. But what we've done is targeted the commercial players in the space. So if you're communicating sufficiently with the commercial players, you will see the reductions that we have seen in the first phase of the ban, and I will come to that in terms of performance, as you'd mentioned. So, meaning on items such as the personal care products, there aren't 20 importers of these items over the last 5 years, and you have about 7 that are regular importers in that space. So you're able to have the discussion with these 7 to 20 companies so that they're very clear that the market that they had built for that space will no longer exist in the time periods that we've discussed. What we have found is that what is required, and absolutely important is not just engagement, but training for, as you mentioned, the customs officers on the front line, the Bureau of Standards team, the NCRA, being the National Compliance Registry Authority, who go into the trade to police the trade, not just for these items, but to look for sub-quality items and items not labeled properly, etc. And we've found that in dealing with the trade, we have had success. How is that success defined? And I always mention that the plastics we target with ban and removal of the waste from the waste stream are the non-recyclable ones. There are other factors that go into it, but just for the general public to wrap their head around, it's the ones that can't go to recycling partners because in large cases they're either non-collectible or they're toxic or contaminated based on how they're used. That's generally how we select the items. Now, with the phases that we have implemented thus far, if you look back to the waste characterization study of 2017 done by the IDB, plastic consumption was about 15% of our waste stream. Plastic bags and styrofoam were estimated to be 1% increment of the total consumption of our total generation of waste in the country. So that targeted 1% of your total waste. Now, how do you measure success in that regard? Well, we certainly know there is no formal or legal importation of styrofoam and those plastic bags. I'm sure there's an illicit trade, as happens in every country, with certain items, especially in what they call, Senator Bunting should remember this from security, the mixed grocery containers that are harder to search. So people carrying a mix of goods, so a box of one item, not in commercial distributable quantities comes in, but you may see a box of plastic bags at a one store or a box of something else. The mixed grocery containers, as they call them. So that's where you do have some challenge, but it's not on an industrial scale. But success has been measured by the fact that we acknowledge we still have waste management challenges, and there is studies of waste as it washes up, unfortunately, on your coast. So if you look at the international coastal cleanup data, styrofoam and plastic bags have fallen off a cliff. So that tells you it's not entering the waste stream because they weren't biodegradable. So prior to the ban, you'd have seen it in every international coastal cleanup there, and a beach cleanup that you'd have done. NEPA's studies from the Ridge to Reef studies that they're working on, I think that one is funded by the Japanese government minister, can also confirm that these items are not widely seen in your waste stream anymore. You do see it sometimes widely in a community where someone is obviously breaching the ban. And in those cases, over 40 players in the market have been prosecuted in that space since that first phase of the ban. Now, what we have seen from that prosecution is where there are repeat offenders, and that is why we'll bring the NRCA fines, not just for these issues, and the wildlife protection fines in very, very short order to this, well, first to the lower house and then to this chamber. So the enforcement is underway. I would say the first phases of the ban have gone relatively well because the waste characterization studies are showing the reduction. There is a point, though, that, you know, with these things, you don't want to cherry pick information. You want everyone to have the information. Post-COVID, globally, there has been a significant increase in single-use plastic consumption. Because during COVID, where you didn't want to reuse containers, and people didn't want to be passing things between persons, it wasn't just on gloves and masks and all sorts of other spray bottles. It was just persons didn't even carry their reusable water bottle to put down in case somebody touched it. They've actually studied the social behavior around this consumption. So we have seen globally, which is why this INC was so important when passed at UNIA, an increase in plastics. And our most recent study, the waste characterization study by IDB, did show that increase. But even in showing that increase, it was not on the items that we had banned, it's on the items that we're recycling. So, to be aware of, because where there are challenges, I don't believe we should beat around the bush. We should all come together to find the solutions. And globally and regionally, especially in Latin America, they've seen that expansion. So you'd have seen in Jamaica where it moved from 15 to 23. But the plastics that are unrecyclable are significantly reduced. So that's kind of where it is. You did mention in terms of legislative contemplations in relation to the customs bill. what has been found and has worked with environmental enforcement is that the regulations under the NRCA Act and the Trade Act have worked quite well for this and are not offensive to the customs bill. And that was a part of the discussion on the back and forth with LRD on this space, and it was found that where it was quite sufficient to deal with the issue. But just to note, in the government technical working group, not the broader one that had all stakeholders, customs have always been at the table, and they have helped us to design this space because so much of these items are actually imported and not manufactured locally. I hope that responds to most of your points.
I'm sorry, Minister, I just didn't, thank you for that. On the items that we mentioned, or the personal care, and the going forward understanding what it means.
So the microbeads, or rather the items that have intentionally added microbeads, which is the official manufacturing term, are not imported by a large number of persons. It wasn't 10 when I looked at the number. So the discussions are underway. The reason why we've added time where they are concerned is their minimum orders are larger than the minimum orders of the plastic food containers. So you risk greater dumping, as you mentioned, if additional time wasn't given there. So there's some SKUs of some of these things that are bought a year in advance before they're actually sold on a supermarket shelf, because the minimum orders are so much larger than the size of our marketplace. So that was taken into consideration with the market study that informed when certain things could be done. So we'll have ample time with those to publish so the public can look out for those, but we don't have a large number of persons to have the discussion with to cut the importation. All right.
Thank you, Minister.
Senator Scott Mosley.
Thank you, President. In a way, I'm following up on that question, and I want to know if there's anywhere now on the ministry's website where I could go to see what products it is that you have under contemplation. So, in other words, I want to know if at this point in time, I already have a product which I should not be using because it has in these microbeads and microplastic. And wondering if your ministry has made that kind of provision where I can actually go and determine where it is now. But I'm not finished, so I would like you to just allow me to. So, while I commend you on this presentation and on the work you're doing, I'm a little disappointed that your policy is still being actively worked on. You didn't say you were updating it. You said you were actively working on it. And I would have thought that that would have been in place already. So I want to know if your policy also includes a garbage disposal, waste disposal. In other words, does it involve the householder at any level? Will you be requiring householders to separate their plastic bottles from other kinds of waste? And I also wanted to know whether or not there will be a thrust to have recycling centers easily available. There are some of us who actively go in search of places that we can put our plastic bottles. I must confess that I was kind of feeling like I should hide my plastic water bottle, which I have underneath my desk, because there are some people who are showing off and have their, you know, their water bottles on full display. And I know if Senator Fraser Binns was here, I would be reprimanded for coming into the Parliament with a plastic water bottle, but not this time. So, but what I'm really getting at is the fact that in order for us to be successful, the public have to be brought on board. And I'm commending those who I see coming on board. But my main concern is the garbage, the waste, because everybody dumps everything in one bag. And I think that there should be a policy and perhaps legislation to say we must separate. And as I said before, the easy accessibility for those of us who actually want to assist in meeting this challenge for us to be able to take our plastic bottles somewhere which is close, and we can also encourage other people to do the same. So those were my questions. I must say that in everything there's an opportunity. And those persons, especially young persons who have been going into natural products, I hope that the government will find a way to encourage them, to incentivize them, thank you, Senator Allen, to expand their businesses. Because almost every fair you go to, or a shopping opportunity day, there are mainly women who are selling scrubs, body lotions, shampoo without microbeads, and things of that nature, which are all natural. And so I think that a prudent administration will find a way to encourage them to substitute for these products, which presently are on our pharmacy and supermarket shelves. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Senator Scott Motley. Minister?
Just go and make it efficient for you, because I don't just have two points. Minister, I know you're big on public education. I see a green light up by your collar, which tells me that you're not depending on Public Broadcasting Corporation. You want to make sure you spend taxpayers' money at least twice to get your presentation out. I see your camera up in the gallery as well. So along this line of public education, I'd like to know how much are we spending in this public education effort around this whole issue of the single-use plastics and the recycling, etc. And I want to make it clear that I'm very supportive of the recycling effort. In fact, I would like to be more informed myself. If you have arranged a tour, for example, of the recycling plant you spoke about for your colleague parliamentarians, I would be very happy to participate because it's an area that I have a general interest in. I'm not an expert, but like everybody else, I understand the importance. Less for me than for my children and grandchildren. So if you could just tell us, give us an idea of the public education program that is put behind this in the current year. The second point or question or suggestion, I should say, is that, and especially when I see my colleague deputy with her plastic bottle, and I recall there was an article a few months ago. It was essentially, it was in media, publishing the studies from Columbia University. I think the study was supported by the National Institutes of Health, and it was talking about that in a liter of bottled water, Donna, a liter of bottled water included about 240,000 tiny pieces of plastic, 90% of which were nanoplastics. And this is 10 to 100 times what was previously thought to exist in these. Now, nanoplastics, and nanoplastics are so small that they can be absorbed at the cellular level of a human being. Now, as I said, I'm a layman, and I personally, it sounds scary, but I can't go beyond saying that. But coming back to the issue, for example, of public education, just translating that for the average person to understand, is it something that we should be concerned about? It sounds like that. I don't like the idea of hundreds of thousands of nanoplastic particles being in my colleague's body after each liter of this bottled water she drinks. But it may be, on the other hand, it may be relatively benign in the scheme of things. I just don't know. But it leads me to my final point, is when we're talking about effectiveness of the mechanisms for enforcement, for, banning some cases on importation and distribution, and so on. We know that none of these are 100%. And we know if it's in the case of importation, we know there's smuggling that takes place. I'm told that scandal bags are still available, only now we have to pay for them. We're used to get them for free. Undoubtedly, the incidence has fallen, by a large amount, and so on. I commend the manufacturers for contributing towards the recycling effort and so on, but I don't think we can rely entirely on self-regulation for something that is so important for our environment and for our health. And therefore, I'm going to suggest, could we have an independent body, such as maybe a research group at UWI, not Capri, but an independent UWI group that could periodically, like every 3 years or so, look at, independently assess the performance of our enforcers or regulators. So, example, you mentioned NEPA and so on. How effective has NEPA been? Based not just on the reports by NEPA of their own effectiveness, but on some independent, objective method of analyzing their performance. It doesn't have to be part of the annual budget, but I think periodically we should have these independent checks on those who have the responsibility for enforcement and so on. So those are my questions and suggestions.
Thank you, Senator Bunting. Minister?
Thank you. Thank you, President.
When I press this, I keep expecting that little green light and you call it to go red. But
it's good that the green light is personally owned. But that's always a good place to use to start. The website listing will go up actually over the weekend, Donna. So it will be on MEGJEC, JIS, NEPA's site, along with very detailed specs. We actually do have pre-design and Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. So, yeah. So that rollout will take place, and we will add social media to it. We will do bulletins through the varying stakeholder groups, and as I have found, there will have to be a 9 to 12 month meeting tour of sorts between the Rotarians, Kiwanians, and church groups. I find them to be as effective, if not sometimes even more effective than other things for these sorts of social changes that you're trying to get support. And you do find, as Senator Bunting would have said, when you give people the opportunity to see it, so you carry the products there and show them, that they become very loud advocates for you, so that they'll call you after and say, send me 2 posters, we'll even print them for our office itself, etc. So you get a multiplier effect when you engage in that sort of way. Now, single-use plastics policy, and I understand perhaps, based on how the statement is structured, why that concern will be there. We had started the single-use plastics policy actually quite a while before. There was a feeling that it would be redundant in terms of completing it before the INC completed its negotiations. Reason being, much of how we'll have to use plastic would then have to change, and you'd have to amend it almost immediately before. Plastics is dealt with under 2 or 3 NSWMA-related policies. It's in their strategic plans. It's in NEPA's strategic plans. There are several harmonized targets across several documents. What we seek to do with the singular policy is to bring all the issues related to plastics in one space. In research, there are very few spaces that actually do have this harmonized plastics policy. Aware of one in Australia and aware of one at the EU level, not even at the individual member nations level. So we are again, in the way that we did exceed certainly neighbors with the Bureau of Standards biodegradability standard actually trying to beat much of the curve in completing this work. The view is that with these things, though you want immediate and large-scale results, that the initial space should be the government send the signal, which is why we are starting the separation of waste in all government institutions, whether schools, hospitals, tax office, courts, wherever. We'll put in the infrastructure towards the end of the year that will facilitate this separation. But it's important to note because when we did carry the updated building codes and I forget the exact name of the act, there's contemplation in those building codes for additional storage for waste to facilitate recycling. So even in past years, we've been contemplating what needs to happen by way of infrastructure to facilitate increased participation at the residential level. I share the frustration in terms of the number of recycling depots. And it's something that we're looking at very closely with recycling partners. There's one called Recycle Jamaica. There's about 3 or 4 that have asked us for additional space to facilitate collection. And I believe that citizens will be very willing to participate once it gets far more convenient and the collection is as efficient. I mean, I have seen significant improvements on the collection from the depots that I do frequent to check to see how they're doing. I think we'll be in a lot better place by the end of the year. Part of the issue was that the manufacturing side of it, in terms of the compression and grinding and sterilization of these items, capacity was low. So there was a bit of a worry to increase the collection space and then be overrun at the manufacturing facility. So the Nagahead facility, I believe, is running at least 2 shifts now, moving one into Manchester and one eventually into Westmoreland, and I know there's plans for one in St. James. We'll start to make it easier to ship these items, because having a collection depot in Negril, you couldn't carry the empty plastic bottles here. The cost of transportation would be too high. In fact, the emissions from the transportation would even be higher than the benefit of saving the plastics. So we do have to transport compressed or grind up plastics. So you do have to have a number of manufacturing facilities to make the transportation feasible to get to the ports for export. Public engagement is going to be in the range of about, public education and engagement is going to be in the range of about $20 million, Senator Bunting, which I think answers questions from both yourself and Senator Scott Motley. Well, 20 million this annum. We have to look at, well, what else is required. We have a number of other public education efforts which we expect to be particularly expensive. This isn't as new to the marketplace as some of the things we'll be doing on protection of our rivers, on new air quality standards, on these things where they'll be being introduced for the first time. So expect to have to invest a little heavier in those areas than we would on something that has been a part of national discourse since 2016, admittedly. Sorry?
Since this has a public health component,
right,
that the Ministry of Health has a much more substantial public education. I think it's over $1 billion. Perhaps you could get some leverage from that source to help get your message out. We'll take it under advisement. Tour the facility for facilities for parliamentarians, I think, would be useful for members of both houses. No objection, and we'll see how we get more support so that it can even permeate through the politics. The question on public health now and nanoplastics, there are varying studies that are all equally frightening, regardless of which one you choose to take. And microplastics are becoming nanoplastics, and the reality is there's very little real estate globally, whether it's the ice caps at either pole or soil in the center of Africa that in areas that haven't really been had human habitation, or in any inch of the ocean that you're not finding micro and nano plastics. So the problem is extreme. It is extreme. The plastics in micro and nano form have been found in fish, in many animals. We're finding it in soil quality. And there is a theory that it is affecting birth rates, as autopsies have found plastics in lungs, in heart, and even in human semen. So the reality is that there is a perception that even maybe that is affecting birth rates. So the issue of plastics is extreme. It's, in the human context, not a very old issue.
because 100 years ago it wasn't the packaging material of choice, but this very cheap material has afforded us food quality standards, or so we thought, certainly prior to some of these standards, that is attributed to some of the reduction in global hunger rates. So, you know, it's, where is the right balance? And the reality is, you know, even when you have the bottle discussion, somebody says glass, we just don't have enough glass. And the energy component of glass doesn't make it affordable, and that then also reduces access to bottled water in several parts of the world that simply require it. So it's an area that requires, I believe, a lot more study. We do need to, as a government, and regional governments and international governments need to engage academia and resource them to do the studies so we know exactly what we're playing with. But there are some troubling initial studies, Mr. President, and that is why the government is doing its best to be proactive in dealing with these issues. We aren't relying on self-regulation. We do check throughout the trade, we check within the recycling community to facilitate not just our own local reporting, but there are several treaties and agreements that we have internationally that require us to report on these standards. So NEPA checks the trade, and invariably to when we produce the State of the Environment report, which is now being produced, which happens every 3 to 4 years. It's usually funded externally and done by external consultants that look at effectiveness of NEPA, forestry, WRA, and varying agencies. And you see, it's published on I believe it's on NEPA's website, the most recent one that was complete. So it shows you the good, the bad, and the not so good, right? So you have the gaps, and that has informed investments that are being made in strengthening capacity in all of our agencies that do interact with the environment. And it has informed even some standards and new policies which are to come, some in a matter of weeks, some in a matter of months, as related to sludge regulations and air quality and some of the amendments that you'll see in the NRCA Act, which are long overdue, along with the amendments to come in the Wildlife Protection Act. So I think that should be it, colleagues, unless... All right, so with that, President, I thank colleagues for their support, not just on the statement, but on the intention of the statement, which is to reduce plastics within our waste stream, and look forward to that continued support on the public education journey so that, you know, even during the political silly season, we can throw in a word to take up the plastic bottle before they leave the meeting, right? Something to that effect. But ultimately, let's work together to reduce plastic waste. Thank you, President.
Senator Samuda, I don't think that anybody in here or in the sound of your voice can fail to be impressed with the depth and command that you have over your subject. And what I want to ask is a similar question, but not as technical. Is it possible, would you say that instinctively you have seen an improvement in relation to the use of single-use plastic material since the ban on the shopping bags? Because remember, to use a word of my colleague, persons were vilified during the ban on plastics. I mean, not politically vilified either, but just people going to the supermarket, and I have been into the supermarket and hear people cussing about the fact that they have to be taking them groceries. Not a scientific analysis, but just a general analysis, a general instinctive view, that's the word, as to whether or not we are making any progress. Because I know, I've seen Senator Bunting in the supermarket with his cloth shopping bag, although he was buying some sort of facial scalp scrub. He was buying a scalp scrub. But I just instinctively, what is the general view as to whether or not we are making any progress? I think Senator Scott Motley asked, but when you go on the beaches, for example, you're not seeing the scandal bags like what you used to see. Just give me a general, tell me something nice to take home.
Well, President, I would say that there is a significant increase in consciousness in terms of the consumption. And I see that, and I would thank NEPA, I'd thank the Environmental Performance Risk Management branch at Ministry, And I'd thank NGOs such as Jamaica Environment Trust who have also invested heavily, time and financially, in the public education effort in bringing that about. Certainly in the formal trade, which is the regulated trade, the trade that is easily trackable, we have seen significant shift in the consumption patterns. We have seen some market-resistant areas that we expect to go back in with another wave of enforcement once the fines are appropriate. Because even within that 40, you would have had cases since with reoffenders in the plastic space because the fines simply didn't meet where they need to. Now, where we are going, we expect that to change very significantly. And with this new phase and your new round of public education and enforcement, to send that right signal. But it would be unfair to citizens to not say that I haven't picked up a significant growth in their consciousness and concern. And you'll hear children sometimes in the supermarket, "Mommy, can I use that? You know, use this." So that's always a good feeling. But I do recall the early days of January 2019 when going to the supermarket was a dangerous place for me, where people would say, "You buy my reusable bag because you have caused this." So no, more than once they were put on my shopping list by persons in the line cashing out, right? So, you know, and at that time we did widespread distribution of bags, especially within low-income communities, to assist where we know there would have been an inflationary impact, and we still do. And there's seldom an event now where someone isn't giving you a reusable bottle or giving you a reusable bag. And if you look in the supermarket, you see these branded bags. So it's not that everybody has necessarily bought them, but the private sector and NGOs and everybody has gotten involved and added their things. So you'll see this foundation, this bank, this cell provider, these parts. So I think to answer your question in short, Mr. President, yes, we expect it to continue. But I think the real win will come when we're able to expand the collection network to match the new production capacity of this recycling network, and that will be the real test. I do hope for a day within, certainly before 2030, when beach cleanups are a thing of the past and we can then focus purely on tree planting exercises or some other area of environmental activism, because that will only come when we've completed the infrastructure purchases and completed the culture change amongst our people, Mr. President.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I don't know if this will be too much of a stretch for me to indicate that along the same lines that Minister Samuda was alluding to a while ago in respect of the production of bags. At the 10th Biennial Jamaica Diaspora Conference, which starts on the 16th of June, our welcome bags will be reusable. Our wonderful jute, natural jute and rope bags. We will be in your town, Senator Allen, of course, welcoming members of the diaspora and many members of private sector on both sides who are in the at the micro level and larger level, who are looking at coming together to discuss how we can build Jamaica and participate in building Jamaica and in building our diaspora overseas. So we are all a part of the process, Minister Samuda, and allow me, Mr. President, to add my voice of appreciation to yours in respect of the incredible command that Senator Samuda demonstrates every time he speaks on matters of the environment. Thank you for edifying us this morning.
You know that I saw a video of him when he was 12 or 13.
Yes.
Circulating on the internet when he was protesting the passage of nuclear waste through the
Jamaican waters.
Caribbean
yes,
waters.
Years ago.
You were 9.
He was 9.
Yes, we
for the
saw
record,
that.
for Hansard. So but on that positive note, which allows you to take more than one nice thing home, Mr. President, I ask for the Senate to be adjourned for a date to be fixed.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that the Senate be adjourned for a date to be fixed. So in favor? Against? This Honourable Senate now stands adjourned for a date to be fixed.